There's a version of Bad Boys that nobody ever saw. And honestly, the world is better for it. The movie that hit screens in 1995 and redefined what a buddy cop film could be almost didn't exist in the form audiences came to love. It came within inches of being a completely different animal, starring different people, set in a different city, made by a studio that ultimately lost its nerve before another one stepped in and let chaos do its work. What looks effortless on screen, the swagger, the explosions, the rapid-fire banter, was a product of near-constant turmoil behind the camera. And when you understand just how close the whole thing came to collapsing, every scene hits differently. The story begins long before any camera rolled, in a writer's room where the concept looked nothing like what eventually made it to the screen. The earliest draft of this film was conceived as something much broader, much sillier, leaning hard into slapstick territory rather than the kinetic action comedy fusion audiences eventually experienced. The stars being considered for those earliest versions would have steered the project in an entirely different direction, and the tone would have been unrecognizable compared to the final product. Hollywood works in mysterious transformations, and this one was more dramatic than most. As the script passed through different hands and different minds, the tone began shifting toward action, while one central concept survived every single rewrite intact. The identity swap premise, where two detectives are forced to pretend to be each other, proved resilient enough to outlast every other element of those original drafts. That comedic backbone became the thread connecting early development to final production, even as everything around it was ripped apart and rebuilt. If you watch the finished film carefully, traces of that broader, sillier original still linger in the margins. The situational misunderstandings, the domestic humor, the banter that sometimes edges toward farce, all of it carries the DNA of a project that started life as pure comedy before ambition and circumstance pushed it somewhere more interesting and far more explosive. What happened once filming actually began was a kind of organized chaos that either destroys a production or accidentally creates something memorable. The screenplay was never locked. Pages arrived constantly throughout the shoot, rewritten overnight and distributed in the morning, with actors and crew absorbing changes between takes and adapting on the fly, without any guarantee of stability, from one day to the next. For most productions, this kind of instability is a death sentence. Schedules collapse, performances become inconsistent, and the overall vision fragments under pressure of constant revision. But something unusual happened here. The rewrites weren't chaos for its own sake. They were surgical adjustments, targeted fixes designed to sharpen timing, improve pacing, and deepen the chemistry between the leads. Lines that didn't land got cut without sentiment. Scenes that felt flat were reworked before anyone had time to get attached to them. The filmmakers treated their script as something alive rather than something finished, and that willingness to keep evolving gave the movie a spontaneous energy that planned productions rarely achieve. The rapid-fire exchanges and natural rhythms between characters owe their existence partly to that relentless pursuit of what actually worked, even when finding it meant tearing apart what they already had. Before any of that production chaos became possible, the project had to survive something far more damaging to a film's prospects than script problems. It had to survive being abandoned entirely. The early development of Bad Boys happened under a Disney-owned label, which sounds strange in retrospect given the film's R-rated attitude and content, but that's where the property lived for a time. Somewhere in the development process, the studio's confidence evaporated. They dropped the project and put it into turnaround, which is Hollywood's polite way of saying they were done with it and willing to let someone else take the risk they no longer wanted. Turnaround is where promising projects go to be forgotten. When one studio walks away from film, others look at it with suspicion, wondering what problems the original backers discovered that convinced them to cut their losses. Many movies never escape that limbo. They circulate briefly, fail to attract new interest, and quietly disappear as budgets expire and talent moves on to projects with actual momentum behind them. The fact that this film not only escaped turnaround but emerged with renewed energy says something about the persistence of the people who believed in it and the willingness of another studio to see potential where Disney had seen only risk. That gamble became one of the better investments in mid-90s action cinema. The gamble extended beyond the property itself to the person chosen to direct it. Michael Bay had no feature film experience when he was handed the reins of a multi-million-dollar production with studio oversight, nervous executives, and 2 television stars whose time was genuinely limited by prior commitments. He came from commercials and music videos, which gave him technical skill and visual ambition, but nothing resembling preparation for particular pressures of feature filmmaking. Handing him this project was either an act of faith or an act of desperation, depending on how generously you interpret the decision. The pressure Bay operated under from his first day on set was unlike anything experienced directors face, because established directors have track records that buy them some degree of professional goodwill. Bay had none of that. Every choice was scrutinized with a specific skepticism reserved for improving talent, and any significant failure would have ended his film career before it meaningfully began. What that pressure produced, though, was something valuable and unpredictable. It forced bold choices. It pushed toward a visual energy that safer, more comfortable directors might never have pursued because they didn't need to prove anything. Bay's desperation to succeed translated directly into the kinetic, aggressive style that defined the film and would go on to define his entire career. Hunger is an underrated creative force, and nobody on that set was hungrier than its first-time director. The studio's nervousness didn't disappear once production began. Reports from the set suggested executives were growing increasingly uncomfortable with what they were seeing, troubled by the combination of a director with no track record, a script that kept changing, and a project with a troubled history that stretched back through development. That anxiety filtered down from the studio level into the daily reality of production, creating an atmosphere where the filmmakers weren't just making a movie, but constantly defending their choices against institutional doubt. Every rough cut became an opportunity for second-guessing. Every daily screening carried the potential for executive intervention that might have fundamentally altered or even ended production. The film had a fight to reach completion against doubt that came not just from outside critics or industry observers, but from the very people whose job it was to support and fund it. What makes the finished product remarkable is how none of that institutional anxiety is visible in the final film. The movie that emerged from that tense production carries an almost absurd confidence, a swagger that suggests not a moment of doubt existed behind the camera. The survival instinct of the filmmakers, their refusal to let executive nervousness derail their vision, became somehow embedded in the film's attitude, giving it a defiance that audiences sensed and responded to without knowing its origins. Working within financial limitations that would have crippled less creative productions, the team discovered that constraint can be a more powerful creative tool than abundance. The budget was modest by the standards of its ambitions, which meant every decision carried weight, and waste simply wasn't available as an option. There was no financial cushion to absorb poor choices, no extra money waiting to solve problems that better planning might have prevented. What this forced was an approach built on the elements that don't require massive spending, sharp pacing, genuine chemistry between performers, clever staging, and a visual style distinctive enough to disguise its own limitations. The finished film carries no sense of compromise or financial strain, which is its own remarkable achievement. The confidence on screen feels like unlimited resources backing every shot, when in reality was a team making the most of significantly less than the film's attitude would ever suggest. That gap between the swagger projected and the budget available represents genuine filmmaking craft, the ability to make audiences feel something that the numbers don't actually support. The decision to set the film in Miami came later in development than most people realize, and its impact on the finished product cannot be overstated. The story was originally planned for a different city, one that would have given it an entirely different visual and atmospheric identity. Miami brought qualities no other American city could replicate in quite the same way. The colors were bolder, the architecture carried its own distinctive character, and the atmosphere balanced danger and glamour in a combination that perfectly suited the tone the filmmakers were pursuing. That balance seeped into every exterior frame, transforming what could have been generic urban backdrop into something that felt like a character unto itself. The pastel buildings, the waterfront views, the palm-lined streets, and particular quality of South Florida light all contributed to a visual identity so complete and specific that imagining the film set anywhere else is genuinely difficult. Miami didn't just host the production, it shaped the production, influencing not just what scenes looked like, but how they felt and what the film communicated about the world its characters inhabited. When location becomes character rather than backdrop, it elevates everything around it, and that's exactly what happened here. Time was the production's most brutal constraint, more demanding even than the budget or the executive anxiety. Both lead actors had ongoing television commitments that couldn't be negotiated away or postponed indefinitely, which meant the entire feature had to be shot within a compressed schedule that simply wasn't built around creative needs. It was built around availability, which is a fundamentally different kind of pressure. There was no luxury of extended rehearsal, no option to hold a setup until light became perfect, no possibility of revisiting a scene days later when a better idea emerged. Choices had to be made quickly and then committed completely, because there wasn't time for the kind of second-guessing that more generously scheduled productions allow. What this pressure produced was a film that channeled urgency into energy, translating the frantic pace behind the camera into the kinetic breathlessness on screen. The constraint and the tone became perfectly aligned almost by accident, with the rush of production giving the movie exactly the breathless quality its story demanded. The clock wasn't just a problem to be managed. It became an invisible collaborator that pushed everyone toward performances and decisions that slower, more comfortable production would never have discovered. Some of the film's most immediately effective elements were created last, designed specifically to solve problems that earlier versions hadn't anticipated. The opening sequence, which establishes tone, character, and energy within its first minutes with remarkable efficiency, wasn't part of the original plan at all. It was conceived and constructed late in production after the filmmakers recognized they needed something that would grab audiences immediately and refuse to release them. Studios understand that modern audiences make their decisions about a film almost instantly, and a weak beginning can doom an otherwise excellent movie before it has a chance to find its rhythm. The opening was essentially engineered for maximum impact, reverse designed from the desired effect rather than growing organically from the story's natural beginning. Knowing this changes how you experience it on repeat viewings. What feels like natural storytelling momentum is actually careful construction, calculated to produce specific emotional responses in the first moments before audiences have settled into their seats. The most natural feeling sequences are often the most precisely manufactured, and this opening stands as a perfect example of that counterintuitive truth about how films are actually made. Production design creates illusions that audiences accept completely without ever questioning their reality, and the police station where much of this film takes place demonstrates that principle beautifully. The headquarters that feels so convincingly like an actual law enforcement facility, worn in and lived in and authentic in its details, was never a police station at all. The production team found a real downtown building, recognized its potential through the trained eyes of location scouts who see what ordinary observers miss, and transformed it through set dressing, lighting, and camera angles into a space that audiences accepted without question. This kind of architectural transformation is common in filmmaking, but rarely discussed publicly because the illusion depends on invisibility. A bank becomes a hospital. An office building becomes a newsroom. An ordinary commercial space becomes the hub of a Miami narcotics investigation. The building itself had no connection to law enforcement and no history as anything resembling what became on screen. The transformation was so complete that it became one of the film's most memorable recurring locations, a space that feels genuinely real precisely because it was never what it appeared to be. The film's climactic airport sequence brought its own category of logistical nightmares, the kind that make production managers age visibly during a single shoot. Securing access to an actual operational airport facility gave the finale an authenticity and scale that sound stages cannot manufacture regardless of budget or talent, but it came with constraints that made every other production challenge look manageable by comparison. Airports operate according to schedules and regulations that pause for nobody, including film crews with ambitious action sequences to capture. Every shot had to be coordinated around actual operations, with windows of access that could close without warning, whenever real logistical needs took priority. The production team essentially became temporary experts in airport operations simply to accomplish what the script required within the time available. What audiences experienced as a thrilling and seamlessly constructed finale was assembled from moments captured within extraordinarily narrow constraints, with planes and tarmac and hangars contributing a sense of scale and physical reality that elevates the sequence beyond what any constructed environment could have provided. The danger feels real because the location was real, and the stakes feel genuine because the production itself was genuinely constrained by reality in ways that added rather than subtracted from the finished sequence. Every significant director eventually develops a visual signature, a technique so associated with their sensibility that it becomes inseparable from their identity as a filmmaker. For Michael Bay, that signature appeared fully formed in his very first feature, already confident and distinctive in a film where he had everything to prove and nothing yet established. The circular tracking shot, where the camera rotates around characters during moments of heroic or dramatic significance, appeared here and would follow Bay into every subsequent project, becoming as identifiable as a fingerprint in the action genre. The technique does something specific to audiences on a level that bypasses conscious analysis. By circling the characters, the camera transforms them into something larger than their circumstances, elevating ordinary moments into iconic ones through sheer kinetic choreography. It announces significance while creating it, insisting through movement alone that what you're watching deserves your full attention and something close to awe. What emerged here as a young director's instinct, perhaps born from desperation to find something distinctive and memorable, became a defining element of modern action cinema that countless other filmmakers would imitate, and that audiences would come to associate specifically with Bay's particular brand of visual storytelling. The seed planted in this film grew into a visual legacy that continued shaping blockbuster cinema for decades. Among the film's many personal touches, one of the most specific and revealing is the sleek black Porsche that moves through the story as an extension of its driver's character. The car wasn't sourced from a studio vehicle lot or rented from a production company with a fleet of appropriate vehicles. It belonged to Michael Bay personally, his own prized possession placed in front of the camera for the world to admire. This personal investment changed the way the vehicle was treated and filmed in ways that are subtle but real. When a director frames something they genuinely own and care about, the resulting images carry a different quality than professional detachment produces. Bay understood his car intimately, knew exactly how to make it look spectacular from every angle, and brought that personal knowledge to every shot involving it. The Porsche became instant character shorthand, communicating wealth, style, and particular kind of reckless confidence without requiring a single line of dialogue to establish those qualities. It's one of the cleaner examples of how personal attachment, when channeled thoughtfully, can add layers of authenticity to filmmaking that purely professional choices rarely achieve. The film's antagonist represents a deliberate or circumstantial choice, depending on which interpretation you find more convincing, to keep villainy functional rather than complicated. The main villain is written lean, largely without backstory, and entirely without the kind of sympathetic dimensions that contemporary audiences often expect from their antagonists. Critics at the time noted this explicitly, pointing to the character's flatness as evidence of underdeveloped writing. Whether this minimalism was intentional, a conscious decision to keep attention focused on the leads rather than diffusing it into complex villain motivation, or simply a byproduct of the rewrite-heavy development process, is genuinely unclear. No definitive statements from the filmmakers exist confirming either interpretation. What's certain is the effect the simplicity produces. By keeping the villain underdeveloped, the film ensures that its energy flows entirely toward a dynamic between the two leads, where the real story was always happening. A more complex antagonist might have been interesting in isolation, but would have competed for attention in a film whose primary argument was always about chemistry and partnership, rather than crime and consequence. Music didn't just accompany this film. It became part of what the film was arguing about itself and the world it depicted. The soundtrack selection wasn't arbitrary playlist building, but careful curation designed to reinforce specific emotional and attitudinal effects at precise moments throughout the story. From the earliest notes, the music announced the kind of experience audiences were about to have, setting expectations and delivering on them simultaneously. The rhythm of certain sequences was constructed around musical choices, with editing and music locked together in a relationship that made each element stronger than either could have been independently. Decades after film's release, certain tracks remain inseparable from specific images and moments in ways that demonstrate the particular power of soundtrack done completely right. The music didn't support the attitude. It was part of the attitude, as essential to film's identity as any performance or visual choice made during production. Beneath the recognizable songs that audiences remembered and radio played, composer Mark Mancina was creating something different and in many ways more essential. His original score provided the connective tissue of the film, the music that builds tension in action sequences, that releases pressure at precisely calibrated moments, that guides emotional responses through scenes without calling attention to itself. This is a work that audiences absorb without registering, the music that shapes experience below conscious awareness. For years after the film's release, fans seeking to own the score found themselves frustrated by its absence from official release, forced to circulate bootlegs and incomplete collections to satisfy a demand that the studio wasn't meeting through legitimate channels. The eventual proper release gave the score the accessibility it deserved, but the long wait highlighted a persistent industry tendency to undervalue the specific contribution of composers whose work operates invisibly, felt by everyone but credited consciously by almost nobody who wasn't specifically paying attention to what was happening beneath the surface. The physical demands of action comedy performance rarely receive the recognition they deserve because effective action performance makes athleticism and strain look effortless and natural. Tia Leone, playing the key witness whose protection drives the story forward, endured considerable physical demands throughout a compressed production schedule that left minimal time for recovery between demanding shooting days. Running stunts, maintaining precise physical marks while projecting genuine terror, sustaining energy levels across hours of shooting. All of this requires athletic preparation and commitment that dramatic performance alone never demands. The craft of action performance lies specifically in this invisibility, when the strain disappears and only the character remains, when audiences see genuine fear rather than physical effort, when the labor behind the performance leaves no trace in the finished scene. That's when the work has truly succeeded. Leone achieved exactly that across production that was demanding her physical commitment, while simultaneously moving at a pace that left little margin for anything less than full engagement in every moment. Everything else in this film, the explosions, the Miami skyline, the guns and cars and chases, serves ultimately as infrastructure for the thing that actually makes it work. The chemistry between Will Smith and Martin Lawrence isn't a feature of the film. It is the film. Strip away every production element, and what remains, the engine driving everything forward, is a specific dynamic between two performers who found something genuine and electric in each other's presence and let that electricity power every scene they shared. Their contrast and approach, their particular way of generating friction and warmth simultaneously, their timing with each other, all of this is what makes the film rewatchable decades later in ways that most action films from the same era are not. The crime story is straightforward because it was never really the point. It exists to put these characters in situations where their dynamic can generate comedy, tension, and ultimately genuine emotional investment. The identity swap premise serves the same function, creating friction between personalities rather than genuine mystery for audiences to solve. What the film understood instinctively was that audiences will follow characters they love through plots they've seen before, but no amount of plot complexity can compensate for performers who simply don't connect. When Bad Boys opened in theaters, critics and audiences responded to it in almost perfectly opposite ways, demonstrating one of cinema's most consistent and instructive patterns. Reviewers acknowledged the energy and star power, but questioned the thin plotting, the underdeveloped villain, the emphasis on style at the expense of substance. Many dismissed it as disposable entertainment, the kind of summer movie that would be forgotten as quickly as it was consumed, replaced by the next spectacle competing for attention. Audiences went in different directions entirely, packing theaters and responding with genuine enthusiasm to exactly the qualities critics had dismissed as insufficient: the swagger, the humor, the explosive entertainment delivered without apology or pretension. All of this was precisely what the film's natural audience was seeking, and exactly what word-of-mouth enthusiastically communicated to friends who hadn't yet bought tickets. The gap between critical reception and audience enthusiasm revealed something important and durable about how popular entertainment actually succeeds. Films don't require critical approval to find and hold their audience, and the qualities that sophisticated reviewers dismiss are sometimes precisely the qualities that general audiences find most satisfying. The opening weekend performance didn't just exceed projections. It shattered them in ways that caught even optimistic observers off guard and forced an immediate reassessment of what this project represented and what it might become. Industry expectations have been modest, shaped by the combination of a first-time director, a troubled production history, and a competitive release environment that offered audiences numerous alternatives. Nobody was predicting franchise-level performance from a modestly budgeted action comedy with improving film talent in the director's chair. Then the numbers arrived, and they told a different story entirely. Strong audience response translated into word of mouth that sustained the film through subsequent weeks without the typical second weekend drop that ends the theatrical ambitions of films that open on hype alone. What the studio had viewed as a reasonable gamble revealed itself as something more significant, and the conversations that followed changed accordingly. Sequel discussions shifted from premature speculation to inevitable planning. Michael Bay's position in the industry transformed overnight from promising newcomer to filmmaker with leverage and a track record. Will Smith's movie star status, already building from television, solidified into something permanent and bankable. A single strong opening weekend reset the trajectory of multiple careers and established a foundation for a franchise that nobody had actually planned for. The R rating wasn't an obstacle production worked around. It was a creative license that shaped the film's entire sensibility and gave it permission to be exactly what it wanted to be without softening anything for broader accessibility. Without the constraint of PG-13 requirements, the dialogue could carry the authenticity of language that real people actually use under real pressure. The banter could be genuinely sharp without the artificial smoothing that family-friendly ratings require. The action could carry consequence and weight rather than the consequence-free kinetics of softer action films that don't commit to reality of violence. The rating became part of the film's identity, and part of it appealed to audiences seeking entertainment with genuine edge and attitude. It distinguished the film from safer alternatives and made a specific promise to its natural audience, a promise that production delivered on completely and without apology. Intensity was the offering, and the rating was a guarantee. Miami's contribution to the film goes beyond the location decision itself, into the specific way the production team used the city as an active storytelling element rather than passive backdrop. The unique architecture, the vibrant colors, the distinctive atmosphere that balances glamour and danger, all of these were deployed as intentional tools rather than incidental environmental features. Art Deco buildings, waterfront vistas, sun-drenched streets, carrying that particular Florida light. These elements appear throughout the film not just as settings, but as active contributions to tone and character. When characters move through these neighborhoods, audiences sense a geography that exists independently of the story being filmed, a real place with its own history and personality that the film is borrowing rather than constructing. That sense of authentic place creates a different relationship between audience and story, grounding fantasy in something tangible and specific. Miami didn't just provide locations. It provided an identity that became inseparable from the film's overall character, and that continues to give it a visual personality distinct from every other buddy cop film made in the same era. The industry impact of the film's commercial success operated quietly, but meaningfully through the decisions it influenced in subsequent years. When a film dramatically exceeds expectations, it becomes data that studio executives cannot ignore when evaluating similar projects, similar talent configurations, similar tonal approaches. No announcements were made about changed thinking or new opportunities recognized. The influence worked through green lights and development decisions, through talent evaluations and production investments that might have gone differently if these numbers hadn't existed as evidence of what audiences would pay to see. This kind of impact is harder to trace than explicit influence, but arguably more significant, shaping an industry's practical decision-making rather than just its critical conversations.